Hi everyone, it's Rio Cloud. In today's session, we're focusing on Windows Autopilot version 2, which is just a re-architecture of Windows Autopilot version 1. And this is also known as the Windows Autopilot Device Preparation policy in Microsoft Intune. Now, before we kick off with today's demo, you'll need to have appropriate roles assigned to your user account. The appropriate roles could be Global Administrator or Intune Admin. And the way we go about validating if I have the appropriate roles assigned to my user account is in Microsoft Entra ID. So first things first, you need to navigate to entra.microsoft.com. On the left-hand service blade, you'll see an option for users. Select users. We'll then search for the user account we're going to be using to set up the Windows Autopilot Device Preparation policy. In this case, it's going to be myself. So I'm going to type in Rio Hindle. It will present me my user account. I'm going to select the display name, and here we've got an option for assigned roles. In the assigned roles, I already know I'm assigned the Global Admin Administrator role, which is a permanent assignment. But of course, if you're trying to adopt zero trust methodology, then it's probably best practice to use least privilege, therefore assign your user accounts Intune Admin. Now, once I've assigned the role, that's step 1 complete. Step 2 would be making sure that our users can join their devices to Entra ID, as that's part of the process when we look at Windows Autopilot Device Preparation. So the way we go about that is on the left-hand service blade again, there is an option for devices. We're going to select devices. There is then device settings, and we want to make sure that our users can join devices to Microsoft Entra. And this option should be set to all. If not, please select to either all or selected. If it is selected, then of course you would have an appropriate security group selected here, which of course you need to make sure your users are a part of. Once you've done that, you've assigned the roles, you then make sure your users can join their devices to Entra ID, because like I said, that's part of the process, especially when we're talking about Windows Autopilot. We want to set up Autopilot, and we of course need to access the Intune console, and we can access the Intune console via intune.microsoft.com. And the purpose of today's video is to look at the Windows Autopilot Device Preparation policy, which is, let's say, the version 2 of Windows Autopilot Original. Windows Autopilot Original was where we would take a device, we would re-image it, and we would repurpose it for kind of business-ready state. But there are a few options, right? We could either bring the laptop in-house, configure it, sign in with the user's credentials, post-join the applications, the scripts, the kind of Win32 apps, so on and so forth, would then be deployed to the device. Or alternatively, we could ask our OEM distributor or hardware distributor to send the device straight to the end user. They would unravel the box, they would of course use their credentials to sign in, and then once again the applications would then post-deploy. This is, like I said, a re-architecture of that original Windows Autopilot version 1, and remember as well, you also had to import the hardware hash ID. Windows Autopilot Device Preparation, which is Windows Autopilot version 2, we no longer need to upload a hardware hash ID, which is really useful, especially when you don't have access to the physical device. And number 2, we can send the device straight to the end user without any, let's say, manual intervention, as the device uses the OEM optimized version of the Windows client already pre-installed. So it's really useful from kind of that perspective. So how do we go about setting this up? Well, we go into intune.microsoft.com. There's an option for devices. Previously, or still, we would access under device onboarding the enrollment service pane. Here we'll see the option for Windows, and of course, as I mentioned, we need to make sure that the device limit restriction is set to, let's say, over 5, just to make sure that users can join devices to, once again, Entra. The way we go about that is by selecting the device limit restriction, select all users and devices, click properties, and just make sure the device limit is set to an appropriate amount. Of course, the recommended practice being 5, because users may have more than one device. If I come out of here, go back to enrollment, if I scroll down, here is where we would originally configure Windows Autopilot. So what would happen was you would configure a deployment profile. A deployment profile would dictate the keyboard language, the type of join, the naming convention of the device, and we'll look at it. So if I type in Windows Autopilot profile. Don't need to give it a description. I also had the option there also to convert existing join devices to Autopilot. So that was let's say a bonus in the Windows Autopilot device preparation policy. That's not feasible at this moment in time. I believe the option or the capability will come at some point, but at the moment this is only possible for Windows Autopilot version 1 deployments. If I select next, I then have the option to dictate whether or not I wanted the user to be assigned to the device on a one-to-one basis and drive that deployment by signing in using their credentials, or the option around self-deploying, where the device would be in a business-ready state for the user on day one. And that typically was configured for shared kiosk scenarios. For example, if you wanted to configure a machine in, let's say, a GP practice, then typically you would configure self-deploying mode, as many users would be connecting to that single device or appliance. But user-driven was the most appropriate option for most administrators configuring Windows Autopilot. We then have the option for, of course, joining the device to Entra, right, as a cloud-only device. But there was also an option to join the device from a hybrid perspective, where the device also resided on-prem, and not only on-prem but also in the cloud. And we would have to install that Windows Autopilot hybrid connector on our local domain controller, which of course had line of sight to the OU where those devices resided. However, that's not possible Windows Autopilot version 2 at the moment. Actually, you'll find that Entra Join is the only possible way of configuring this profile. And then, of course, you had the logistics around it, which was, did you want the users to be an admin? Did you not? I.e., did you want to put them in the local administrator group, or did you want to remove them from that? Do you want to set up the keyboard language, UK English preferred? And did you want to apply a device name template, which once again isn't possible in Windows Autopilot version 2, but was in version 1. And it's not to say you can't coincide these, you can use them side by side. You just need to make sure that there's no device group conflict, right? And if you do have the same profile, i.e. You've assigned an Autopilot profile in the legacy version to the same user you've assigned it to in the new version, the Windows Autopilot original version 1 will supersede that assignment scope. Same principle if you've already onboarded the device via the hardware hash ID, that also supersedes the new way of onboarding devices via the Windows Autopilot device preparation policy. So please keep those, let's say, caveats in mind when configuring this. And then, of course, we would assign this typically to a device group. And that device group we would create as a dynamic membership rule, which would be picking up all the hardware hash ID devices. So if I go into devices and go to, what am I looking for? Sorry, groups, groups. You'll notice that I have a group called Windows Autopilot devices. Oh, in here, was members, and the members were devices. This group has a dynamic membership rule assigned to it, where it's looking for the hardware hash IDs for the devices I deploy. And actually, this is the Windows Autopatch one, so if we go back one, there should be one for Windows Autopilot, unless I've removed it. There we go, SPF Autopilot devices. So this is the correct group, and in here we got dynamic membership rule, which is looking for the device syntax of anything that starts with ZTDID, which is any hardware hash devices we've imported into Intune. And with that, those devices will then auto propagate into that group, of which we've got that Windows Autopilot profile assigned to. So anything we import moving forward will automatically propagate into this group, and they'll pick up that Windows Autopilot profile, which was very useful and automated the process. Not only that, we were then able to assign the likes of configuration profiles, compliance policies, and apps to that single group, which made life easy for all of us. Now, if I go back to enrollment, so what we previously would have done, like I said, was create that deployment profile, create that security group, which the profile was then assigned to. We then had the option to set up an ESP page, which was an enrollment status page, where we could present a, let's say, a policy tip to the user while they're going through that out-of-box process, i.e. signing in with their Entra ID credentials, right? the end user will typically want to know what's going on. Where is it in its application deployment? Has it joined to Entra as of yet? Right? Has the security policies been pushed down? Is it ready for me to use? Well, the only way the end user would be able to visualize that is by you pushing out an enrollment status page. And by default, there's already one created for you, and it had the default properties set as no. So by default, the users wouldn't see any progress. However, we could configure this and we could set up a threshold of failure. So if the machine didn't configure within the specified time limit, the specified time limit being 60 minutes, then we want to present a custom help page to the user to say, please contact the IT help desk. This device hasn't been configured correctly. There needs to be some sort of manual intervention, or someone needs to remote on this device to help resolve any outstanding issues. And also other stuff like, we want to block the device use until all apps and profiles are installed. So it was a nice way to present a page to a user to make sure that they're under the same understanding as you of where the device is in regards to enrollment. And once again, that would then be assigned to that Autopilot device group. In this instance, the default one is assigned to all devices, but you could of course configure that to your liking. So once more, we create the deployment profile. We would have created the ESP page. If you are using the hybrid join devices, then of course you would have installed the Intune connector. And the last but not least would then be to import the device to Intune, right? How do we get it into Intune? Well, we need to get the hardware hash ID. We would typically have sourced the hardware hash ID via a PowerShell script, which is the get-Windows Autopilot info, import hardware hash ID to a kind of your C drive or wherever. Or alternatively, you could access the Access Work or School, right, pane on your physical desktop. There you could export a diagnostic package, which would then be saved in your C drive, and within that diagnostic package would be the hardware hash ID for the device. Alternatively, your OEM distributor could also export a CSV of all the hardware hash IDs and import that on your behalf. So it really depended on, one, where you're purchasing the kit, who you're purchasing the kit from, and two, how you wanted to go about deploying this Windows Autopilot profile to the devices. Now, with Windows Autopilot version 2, that we alleviate that requirement. We don't need to import the hardware hash ID, which alleviates the need to have access or line of sight to the physical device, right? Which is really useful. So now we can come out of here and we can select device preparation policy. So we can configure the device for initial provisioning. There are a few requirements in relation to device preparation policy, such as it only supports Windows 11, it doesn't support Windows 10, which of course the original version does. Microsoft Entra Join is only supported. Once again, hybrid join is not supported. There is no hardware hash ID, which needs to be registered. If you've previously registered a hardware hash ID for a device, that needs to be removed. And of course, it used the OEM optimized version of the Windows client. Also, another big thing, it is user driven, i.e. a user needs to sign into the laptop. It can't be, let's say, self-deployed as per a kind of a shared kiosk device. The only supported shared device is through Windows 365 Frontline, right? So if we go to device preparation policy, it asks the correct profile. Once again, automatic or user driven. Automatic is that Windows 365 Frontline shared device way of doing things. User driven is the typical manner where a user would sign into the device with their Entra ID credentials. And what would happen is it will go through what we like to call enrollment time grouping, where as soon as the user enters their Entra ID credentials, the applications, everything that needs to be installed on the device is installed on the device as soon as the user enters their registration, their details. And how that works is when they register their details, that device is then created in Entra ID and is placed into a security group you dictate. That security group is then, of course, assigned to the appropriate apps you're trying to deploy to the device. So we'll select user driven and you'll see how this works. So Windows Autopilot Device Preparation Deployment provides the ability to configure deployments from a single policy of bundles. All the deployment settings we've just been through as part of Windows Autopilot version 1, and then track essential policies, apps and scripts to provision. What's new? We can select a small number of policies, managed apps and scripts. The limit being 10, by the way. We can deploy 10 applications to the device through the device preparation policy. You can of course deploy more outside of this, But once again, it won't go through that enrollment time grouping, which is where it will deploy it straight away when the user signs in. And set up Entry ID security group that will contain all your Autopilot devices when they enroll. And once again, that's needed for that enrollment time grouping. So what we'll do, create another profile, Windows Autopilot, and I'm going to call this one version 2. And then we need to select an Entry ID security group that will contain your Autopilot devices when they enroll. The policies, apps, and scripts intended for the device should be assigned to this group either explicitly or implicitly through the group owner membership. So either through a static assignment or via a dynamic membership role, right? And we can search a group. And let's say I just search Autopilot devices. Let's imagine this Autopilot device is empty, right? It's not in a dynamic group, okay? Press next. So this is where my device is going to reside after the user has entered their Entry ID credentials. Deployment settings, user driven, that's the only option. Like I said, deployment type will then be single user because they're entering their Entry ID credentials, and like I said, hybrid is not supported. User account is of course going to be standard users for most deployments. You don't want to give everyone local admin rights because they can install anything at any given time, and that's probably not best practice. Out of box experience, this is like that ESP page we talked about. So it's just once again a consolidation of all those version 1 capabilities. Applications, as I said, 10 managed apps at a time. The annoying thing here is when you expand this scope, it removes the last option. So you have to unexpand this scope, and then you can select scripts, and then you can deploy any PowerShell scripts you may want to deploy. Once you configured all these settings, you can press next. You can give it a scope tag, so you can filter accordingly in the engine console, and then assignment. So which users are you assigning this Autopilot version 2 profile to, so that then they can enroll their devices using the Windows Autopilot service, right? So there's only two things you really need to dictate here in regards to the Autopilot piece. One being, where do you want these devices to reside, right? Which group are these devices going to live in once the Entry ID credentials are joined? And two, which users do you want to be able to enroll their devices into the Windows Autopilot service? Other than that, it's of course just configuring the usual stuff such as app deployments, PowerShell scripts. Do you want it to be cloud only joined, user driven joined, so on and so forth. And then next, once you've done that, it's all good to go, right? You would receive the kit. You'll go through the out-of-box experience as usual, and like I said, you can use the traditional OEM optimized image. You don't have to re-image it through an OSI, and then sign in using the Entry ID credentials, and it will pick up this Autopilot profile. Of course, you can monitor the progress of this from an administrative perspective by pressing monitor, and under here you've got Windows Autopilot Device Preparation deployments, and it'll give you an enrollment day, what phase it's currently in, is it enrolled, is it not enrolled, is it ready to be enrolled, the serial number, when it was deployed, and the user assigned to the device. So it's a nice way to monitor the device enrollment. Other than that, in devices, you would have noticed there's also another new option for Windows Backup and Restore. Here we can actually configure funny enough, a backup and a restore of users' properties and settings they've configured on a previous machine and carry that over to a new machine. Just like OneDrive carries our files from one machine to a new machine, this will carry all our settings and configuration. So once again, it's another new capability and feature Microsoft has pushed out, which is currently in public preview, which allows us to easily enroll new devices or existing devices wherever and at any time. So it's pretty cool. Any questions, please let me know. But that's pretty much it. We went through where we used to configure Windows Autopilot, being the Windows Autopilot version 1, and the new Windows Autopilot version 2, which is Windows Autopilot Device Preparation. That's all it takes. And of course, anything other than that, of course, you can configure your authentication for passwordless, which would be Windows Hello for Business. You can encrypt the volume on the laptop itself through BitLocker. You can set up secure boot, code integrity through the EDR capabilities, and then just integrate with the likes of conditional access to restrict only compliant devices from accessing your network and services. The world's your oyster from that point onwards. But thank you very much. Any questions, please let me know. I know I traditionally don't do engine content, but I thought this would be a quite useful video. Thank you.